So from the previous panel that we just had, it's no mystery that right now we live in a time, an unprecedented time, of great uncertainty. Our enemies and our adversaries are many in number, and the challenges don't really stop. However, there's an adage at West Point that I think most of the other service academies and the other universities here can acknowledge is one of the best in order to understand these, which is that in order to address and solve these problems, you must first have a solid understanding of what truly makes them operate, what makes our adversaries operate. And in order to get this understanding, you must have individuals with immense knowledge, which is something that we have the fortunate privilege today to have with our panel of speakers, whose background and reputations are so great that I had to put them all down onto a list just to read them off because I don't have that good of a memory. Starting first with Major General Shane Buzza, my apologies. He assumed responsibility as the Chief of Staff of the United States Army Forces Command on October 1st. Prior to his arrival to Fort Liberty, he served as wartime Chief of Staff for 8th Army, Camp Humphreys, Republic of South Korea. Major General Buzza received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Field Artillery from the United States Military Academy, West Point, New York, on May 25th, 1988. He served with the B Battery during Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989. Following the events of September 11th, he served 2 stateside tours in support of Operation Noble Eagle, 20 and 24 months respectively. He has served in Japan during Yamasukura 67 and the Republic of Korea 11 times, supporting theater-level training events since August 2013. He holds a bachelor's in science in mathematics from West Point, master's in physical therapy, and master of arts in physical education degrees from California State University, Fresno, and a master's in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College in Carlos Barracks, Pennsylvania. Moving on to our next speaker, General Robert P. Ashley, Jr. He retired from the U.S. Army on November 2020 after over 36 years of active duty service as an intelligence officer. He assumed his last duty position on October 3rd, 2017, when he became the 21st Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He formerly served as the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, where he was the senior advisor to the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff for all aspects of intelligence, counterintelligence, and security. He has commanded at the company, battalion, squadron, and brigade levels with 6 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan as squadron brigade commander, and Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence. Lieutenant General Ashley has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in political science from Appalachian State University and a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the National Intelligence University, formerly known as the Defense Intelligence College, and a master's degree in strategic studies from the United States Army War College. Lieutenant General Ashley is currently the CEO of Ashley Global Leadership and Security. Lastly, moving on to our moderator, Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Jin. He completed his undergraduate studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point in 2005 and immediately began a graduate degree fellowship at the East Western Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Since then, he has completed several professional military education courses as part of his career as an active duty Army officer, most notably the Command and General Staff College and the Joint Forces Staff College. As an instructor, he has served as the Professor of Military Science at the Sol Price School for Public Policy at USC from 2021 to 2022. His research focus is on U.S.-Sino relations in the 21st century, Chinese military modernization after 1979, and cross-strait relations in an era of great power competition. He is also interested in the evolution of foreign language acquisition, training, maintenance, and retention of military linguists since 2001. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel here today has a vast amount of knowledge, and I think I speak for all of us when I say that we look forward to what they have to offer. Thank you.
Thanks, Cadet Plank, and thank you for all of you for being here today. It is quite an honor for me to moderate this panel and to be on the stage with these great gentlemen who have illustrious careers in public service, and I know we all look forward to hearing from them. So without further ado, gentlemen, my first question to you that I wanted to jump right back into was, we have heard senior political and military leaders talk that we live in a time of great uncertainty. And I was hoping that you could share with the audience to help them better understand what you're seeing as in the global framework as that which is most concerning. And I'd like to start first with General Ashley.
Well, first, thanks. Great to be here. For me, it's always a tremendous opportunity to see the next generation that's coming forward, and I am your token ROTC grad between the West Point graduates here from the Academy, so you can chuckle a little bit. All right, stop. Show of hands if you are 5 years old or younger on 9/11. Raise your hands high. If you were 5 years older or had not been born on 9/11, raise your hands. Okay, so that gets into context, right? Things you can study and things that you lived through. And as we have this conversation, I think in many ways it'll be a continuation of what you heard David talk about. Matter of fact, I wrote a list of things that I think we can expand on what David covered, having read his book, which is worth your time. But just a couple of things as a preamble before we go into the, what's the most concerning. One, thanks for your interest in national security, for why you're here and what you do, because this is your fight for the rest of your life. This is your fight for the rest of your life. You ask me what I'm concerned about the most. Every day I get up, I start my day as I did when I was on active duty. I spend a couple hours going through think tanks, the papers, whatever else I can get my hands on at the unclassified level, and I continue to read and educate myself. When I see my family, when I see my kids, when I see my grandkids, when I see my nephews and nieces, every time I see them, and I don't share this with my niece and her sons, which are 16, 13, 11, is we have a huge responsibility ahead of us. Otherwise, they're going to war. And my grandsons are going to war, and they're 5 and 3. There's a great quote from General Mattis where he said, we have to get this right. This generation has to understand and account for the rise of China as we move ahead. There's a great deal of complexity. It's easy to talk, and if anybody ever tells you they have the answer to these issues, they don't. The biggest thing I could tell you is be a voracious reader of history. You heard that from David. Educate yourself. Don't outsource your thinking to someone else. Do your own critical thinking, your own analysis, your own reading, your own preparation. We'll give you perspectives on how we see certain issues, but you got to do your homework. And that's your homework in life as you move ahead, as you go through these elections, as you go through various issues in your professional careers. Senior military leaders, and Shane's still in uniform, and I've heard this now for probably close to a decade, the most dangerous time of our lives because of what's in play. And that really is, as we come back to this advent of great power competition. And then the 4 main countries of concern, but there's a whole number of issues that float around those things, whether we talk about cyber, we talk about synthetic biology, proliferation of weapons, artificial intelligence, but the principal crux of that is, how do we set this relationship with China and Russia going forward? As David talked about it, because they see us as a containing adversary. As a matter of fact, I think actually you'd probably be closer to enemy than just say adversary. I think that plays well for us in terms of the lexicon of what we use. But the other part of it is, what's the problem we're trying to solve? So in the military, one of the things you get taught is, okay, so let's make sure we've defined the problem we're trying to solve to make sure that we're actually solving the same problem. And whether you go to the National Defense Strategy from back during Mattis's era, what was in the defense strategy, the problem was the military capability, the advantage that we have, that gap is closing. But the problem is far greater and far more complex against all the national instruments of power. But we have to sort that out. But when you talk about, and whether you want to say the rules-based order or the liberal rules order that was put in place at Bretton Woods that have carried us over the last nearly 80 years, is the challenge is those 2 particular adversaries and others like Iran and North Korea, their perspective is, this is not the world order that we signed up to. We want to vote, And we want to provide an alternative course of action, an alternative leadership to the U.S. And that plays out every day across all the national instruments of power. And that's the complexity of the problem that we face. So it's far more complex just than the military issues and the weapons and things that we see. It goes into the fabric of everything that we are: ideology, economics, influence, a multitude of things. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, sir. General Buzza, to you again. What are you seeing as in the global framework that's most concerning to you from where you sit?
Thanks, Chris. And appreciate the forum for having me here. Express my views here. It is Buzza. So my dad says it sounds like a Southern doorbell. Ring the Buzza. Right, so there you go. So I'm going to basically, I want to take just a couple of points and extend right off of what you said too. Two things. The big thing about the uncertainty is that our future is unwritten. One of the things my boss, General Pappas, FORCECOM commander, happens to be a classmate as well, he puts it in these terms, and it was enlightening to see the hands go up with respect to 9/11. But after 9/11, we were on 20 years, and we kind of grew up on a wash, rinse, repeat cycle. We knew when we were going to deploy. We knew where we were going to deploy. We knew the enemy. It took some time to learn, but after a while, it was the same thing. It was the same echelon of war. We had defined a brigade combat team as a unit of action. We had developed the specific doctrine to fight that. And although there were other things going on, we had pretty certain predictability in where we were going. So that was then. But as General Ashley said, much different environment now. And what's most concerning is that it's multiple echelons of war, multiple threat types. You look at instability in Haiti, that requires us to send a very small contingent of support to major ground operations happening in Ukraine. We have for the last couple of years a large contingent of security assistance group supporting Ukraine, looking at that problem set and learning from it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But those are really the key elements of that point. The other point is the domains. So before, and we really do provide the ground combat forces for the joint force. That's our role as the Army. We want to deter, but if we don't deter, we deploy and win. We typically operate in a ground environment, but that's just one of 5 domains. And we've got to be able to deliver capability to the joint force commander across all 5 of those domains. So that would be land, sea, air, space, and cyber. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go in through the panel. But that's part of the complexity as well, the uncertainty that I think we're facing as a challenge.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah,
Sir, did you have a
so
please?
if I were to ask you to give me the 3 pillars of deterrence, do you know what they are? All right, so we talk about deterrence, we talk about integrated deterrence. David Sanger talked about deterrence, right? And one of his comments was, well, you can't deter if you don't really know about the capability, right? So one of them is impose cost. Right? I can actually do something to you, deny you benefit. I can deny you the benefit of a capability because I can preclude you from using it. But the other part of that is, and what he alluded to, is you have to be unequivocal in the message that if you do this, here's what I'm going to do. Now take a look at that in a number of decisions you've seen that have transpired over the last 4, 5, 6 years. How many times have we set red lines where we didn't hold somebody accountable? And then think about integrated deterrence. It's kind of like a Rubik's Cube, right? When somebody walks in and says, well, I've got a solution for the military piece of this. Okay, well, you've solved the green panel. That's fascinating. I need you to solve all of the Rubik's Cube. And there's a commission on the National Defense Strategy that said, integrated deterrence makes sense. It's about all the national instruments of power, of how we apply them, but there really is no strategy behind that other than we've talked about it. And it's very, very hard to get all of the interagency, all of that complexity in the U.S. government to truly have an integrated deterrence strategy. It makes sense in theory. The challenge is in application. But think about those 3 pillars when somebody talks to you about deterrent. And then the last comment I'd have on deterrence is a comment a 4-star made at a conference probably about 2013 when he said, our enemies respect us, but they no longer fear us. So think about that in the context of deterrence. Our enemies respect us, but they no longer fear us. If you went back 15 years ago, now so many variables changed, but do you think the Iranians would have actually launched 100 missiles and rockets against Israel over a decade ago? So that deterrence, that threat, that counter, that calculus changes over time. And some of that is perceptions of what we'll do and how we'll react. And you saw that in Putin's decision to go into eastern Ukraine after what we didn't do in Crimea.
Thank you for that comment, sir. I wanted to kind of pull the thread then on imposing costs. So as NATO nations celebrate the 75th anniversary, I know in the afternoon we have a NATO panel as well. We've seen this alignment of China and Russia that Dr. Sanger spoke about as well. There's a comment from the UN Secretary General back in July, and I'll quote, it says, he said, China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its no-limits partnership and support for Russia's defense industrial base. This includes the transfer of dual-use materials such as weapons components, equipment, and raw materials, end quote. From your perspective, is this partnership between Russia and China truly no limits? And what might China support? How might we counter China's support or see it diminish over time?
There are limits. So every nation will make decisions on their own national interests. There are times that nations will align and support us, and just from a U.S. perspective, and there are times where those national interests diverge. So if you look at, actually, I went to an awards ceremony years ago where we had, a couple of our closest partners, the Brits and the Australians. Of course, the Aussie who was at the podium used that as an opportunity to make a point that every time the U.S. has been in a conflict, we've been there. But there was one time the Brits were not. Which one was it? Somebody said it. Vietnam, right? So it was a chance for the Australians to dig a little bit, with a special relationship. It is not a relationship without limits. Every nation will act on their own national interests. There's a great quote from Lord Palmerston, who was the Prime Minister of the UK back in 1870, said, nations have enduring interest, not enduring allies. I'm paraphrasing. And so it does change over time and over interest. So there will be red lines, there'll be thresholds where Xi Jinping will not move forward. Imposing the cost is, part of that is coming through the sanctions that you see right now. And so that will have some degree. I'm not sure where that gets to a point, but it's absolutely critical for them as a mercantilist society to be fully integrated into the global economy. I mean, they lead with economics. And so that is absolutely critical to them. I'm not sure when it was issued, but there was a recent communique from the Chinese, and when we talked about that no limits, which was right before the Olympics, the phrase that was used in a recent communique from the Chinese was a confluence of interests. A confluence of interest. No limits was, and my interpretation, purposefully not in that communique. So there are limitations to it, and then you don't see them providing full-up weapon systems, you see them providing components, other things that will, whether it's chips or things like that, that will aid. And it is to his advantage to have this authoritarian regime continue to be successful, but to a point. We're just not sure what that point is and how much pressure we can put on them, from a sanctions standpoint, or just whether that becomes our own information operations on global influence to play that against the actions of the Chinese in supporting Russia.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that answer. General Buzza, actually sticking with the Ukraine-Russia war, we can assume that our adversaries are learning from the actions, not beyond Russia, our adversaries are learning from the battlefield there in Ukraine as well. What, in your opinion, has been the most surprising military innovation that you've seen on the ground there, and how are U.S. land forces integrating those lessons as we prepare for future large-scale combat operations?
There was no shortage of military lessons coming out of Ukraine. It's an interesting way to phrase the question in terms of most surprising, and then what we're doing about it. Before we get into the surprising, I mean, you just look at the endurance right now. Many experts expected this not to, clearly last 2.5 years. And yet, here we are. The use of aerial systems, unmanned aerial systems, the UAS fight, it's a lot more prolific than many expected. And then I think probably the most surprising, though, although we expected electromagnetic warfare, I don't believe we expected the impact to have on the battlefield that it has, or the extent to which Russians could employ it effectively against Ukrainian systems. And so when you look at electromagnetic warfare from a protection perspective, Russians layer their defense with that. They're able to counter multiple systems from Ukrainians that are coming in, almost to the point where they render many of them ineffective. And there's been, essentially what's happened is then Ukrainians will counter with their electromagnetic warfare. And so you've seen something of like a tit-for-tat acceleration and progression of drone warfare on the battlefield, which has been an incredibly useful learning tool for all of us. The big takeaway for the U.S. military is the lesson that in order to use these things effectively, it takes a considerable amount of training, individual training and expertise, and then a doctrine to place that capability. You've got to invest both in the capability and in the training, and we've got a ways to go there. We'll probably, hopefully, and if we don't cover it in the panel questions, perhaps somebody asks during Q&A, talk a little bit about transformation and how we're transforming units in real time now. It was a fun comment about David talking with respect to programs that are actually ahead of schedule. We actually have one. So we're excited about transformation in contact and continuous transformation. Maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about that. But and so we have to invest that. We've got to do the training. We've got to put that capability in Army formations.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Did you have a comment as well, sir?
So one of the big things we're seeing is innovation in the battlefield. Another outcome of this is attritable systems. So a lot of the drones and things they're using are not very expensive. They've been relatively effective, and we have to absorb all of that. If you go and pull out the Wall Street Journal today, you'll see an article by General Petraeus, and he talks about one of the challenges we have is the speed in which technology is moving, and how do you scale that to a 1 million-man army to train and equip and do all the due diligence you have to do. It's a different scale with Ukrainians and what the Russians are doing. So that in itself is a challenge. One of the big things that we look at is information advantage. So if you look at joint all-domain command and control, and think about the OODA loop of how you orient, decide, and act. So your ability to see the battlefield, to see what's happening, to understand, and then decide and act faster than your opponent is critical. And so we've seen an interesting application also of open source capabilities from industry. And I'm not working for Palantir, but I'll just say, Palantir, for example, they are providing capabilities to the Ukrainians to be able to see what's happening on the battle space. Think about commercial space, because one of the questions was, hey, we want to talk about space today. You have synthetic aperture radar, you have radio frequency, you have electro-optical, all of it's commercial. And can be moved in relative near real time to the Ukrainians, from the U.S. or direct, in some cases, direct contract with them. And it's unclassified, which means it's immediately shareable. You have lots of data that's being gathered through social media. The Russian soldiers love to post where they are. That allows us to track them. You pull up from social media, it's geotagged off the phone. You can aggregate that together, and you can put together a picture where the forces are moving. So there's so many things from an information advantage standpoint that we're seeing and how we leverage commercial industry, commercial capabilities that get layered upon and integrated with all these really pristine classified systems we have. And it's not a binary choice. We really need to think more of how do we integrate this, because it's not, we shouldn't think about it as how we buy data, but we extend the enterprise, at least from an intelligence standpoint. How do we bring these capabilities to bear? Because right now they're being incredibly impactful. So that's part of one of the lessons we're pulling away and then you'll definitely see that in space. Because a big part of the space strategy right now is, what Chris Scalise does with the NRO, And how do you build resiliency, but also how do you build additional capacity? Because there's a lot of things that are going to get knocked out of space if we go to a conflict with a near-peer competitor.
Thank you for that.
Have an
Sir,
alibi round.
please.
Yeah, can I do alibi fires?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this is awesome because it makes me think about what else we have to do for training and what we need to do at our National Training Center and our JRTC. Both of the training centers they're inside of Forces Command. And so with respect to being detected in the spectrum, and we've been doing this for a few years actually, is to hide in plain sight and then to use decoys. And so to train that to be effective, to not be found, is critical because the ability to be seen, it's almost impossible to not be observed. You kind of got to go in with the assumption that you will be observed. So then it's about mission command on the move. Elon's got an outstanding satellite system, and for us to use that, the commercial solutions is, I think, critical for our way ahead.
Thank you, sir. Stepping back from Russia, Ukraine, I did want to ask one more question before we get into our Q&A portion. How is the U.S. military preparing to address threats from non-state actors or potential client states of China, Russia, and Iran, particularly in areas where we have a waning physical military presence, like in the Middle East and Africa and even maybe the global South?
You want me to tackle that one?
Either one of you gentlemen.
Well, so this is a persistent challenge, and it's not going away. And we've been in counterinsurgency operations for a long time. But I think we have to choose our fight. We can't swing at every pitch. We don't have the resources for this. So what we do is we build capacity elsewhere with our partners. And we do that in a number of ways. And there, 3 ways come to mind quickly in terms of like the Indo-Pacific. I think China, we're a thorn in their side in terms of ensuring freedom of navigation through the South China Sea, throughout that entire region. Because we partner like our Pacific Pathways exercises every year. We're spending tens of millions of dollars to show joint force presence, to project power. We send Combined Arms Battalion deployed on emergency deployment exercise. They're there in 72 hours. They fall in on pre-positioned equipment. They roll out and they're ready to fight. That's real power projection, and that shows and demonstrates that we can be where we need to be. That presence and then the exercises that we do in that theater build capacity for our partner nations, the alliance nations that we have in that theater. And that would go for any region, just the exercise program. The second area that we do it is in our Security Force Assistance Command. We've got 5 Security Force Assistance Brigades stationed across the world in key areas, and it's really the by, with, and through where they do train, advise, and assist mission, again, building partner capacity, because giving the allies that we have in those regions additional capability and capacity to thwart those threats allows us to extend our influence without investing as much resource. And then finally, the third one is our Army National Guard's state partnership program. The Connecticut Guard right here has got I believe it's a 24-year relationship with Uruguay, thank you. And that's been fantastic. They go down there, they assist well drilling, they do partnership with C-130 missions, they've been firefighting exercises as well. And so, just having that presence, it makes a big difference. And I think that's how we're going to influence on the military side. And I'll leave to General Ashley the other instruments of national power, the way that we deal with those extension non-state actors and those that are empowered by our adversaries.
Thank you, sir.
So these are dime problems, right? These are diplomatic, information, military, and economic problems. One of the things we just always kind of say lightheartedly from the Defense Intelligence Agency from a military standpoint is, and we have the ambassador back there, so hopefully you'll get a chuckle out of this, is Plan A is diplomacy, State Department, right, as a lead. We are in the military, we're all about Plan A. We want Plan A to be successful. And we're a huge part of supporting Plan A. Plan B is a big lift. If you're a combatant commander, if you're the 4-star in a COCOM, you have all these contingency plans, but you're working hard with the diplomats, you're working hard with all the ambassadors in all these nations, because what you don't want to happen is, I don't want to have to start my plan B, right? When you start going to war, then plan A and other things are starting to fail, but that's your worst case and you got to have it in place. So that's important. So that's something that we always look and consider. The other piece is, so your question is, well, how do we do all of this, right? You can't be everywhere. There's a commission on the National Defense Strategy that just came out this year. Jane Harmon, Representative Harmon, who was on the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence out of California, and Ambassador Eric Ottoman. It's a pretty damning story. Google their testimony to the Senate Armed Service Committee because they lay out that threat, the most consequential threat we have had since World War II. Because what we kind of said was, hey, we'll get into one major theater war and we'll hold in another. I don't think we're going to have that necessarily that option. David alluded to that. Now the complexity of competition into conflict with a China and a Russia with two nuclear powers. And I agree, they don't necessarily integrate and fight as one. That's a whole different discussion if you want to talk about that one. But this commission lays out things that we need to do, not only in the military. I mean, it's just training technicians, it's education, it's every aspect of our society, because all that plays into our national security. All of that, to include people that take classes on national strategy. Right? For Arthur's class that he teaches at the University of Connecticut, that's part of that foundation. So go read that study. Google the Senate Armed Service Committee hearings on the Commission on the National Defense Strategy and listen to the concerns they have, because going forward, we're not always going to have the luxury of a decision. As you said, we don't know where the next conflict's going to be or how many. And so it's, nobody pays to see the one-ball juggler. So we can't leave the Middle East, And I know General Carrillo right now is fighting for every ISR and asset that he has, and he's got a lot of stuff there based on what's taking place in Gaza and in Lebanon and with the other nations that he's responsible for. We've got to increase our capacity because the complexity of the problems are only growing.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to the audience for questions. I'm sorry, actually, yes, Cadet Plank is going to be our first question, then we'll go to you. I'm sorry, I'm out of order, please.
Gentlemen, thank you for this panel. It's been an amazing opportunity to get to listen to you all speak. General Buzza, you had brought up previously the SFAB and what they've been doing in Europe and across the world. This past summer, I had the opportunity of getting to spend some time with the SFAB in Albania, and they had brought up some concerns regarding certain members of our allies that we have in Europe, particularly their democratic backsliding that they've been seeing over these past couple of months and years, alongside talks of politicians here in the United States about disbandment or defunding of NATO. Whenever we look at our allies in Europe and across the world, how do we prevent them from losing confidence in us and possibly becoming future adversaries?
How about I answer it like this? What do we do to keep those alliances strong, right? That's kind of the essence of that question, right? I think that comes from leadership and maintaining and fostering. I'll hand this over to you, sir, in a minute. But fostering the relationship and the investments, and leading by example, and that's where it comes. But I think going to one of General Ashley's points just a little bit earlier in this talk was everyone has their own interests, and you got to work for your own state first. That's what your folks, that's everybody that you're elected to or appointed to lead, that's your responsibility. So I think we've got to say and acknowledge there are times when some members aren't going to be able to deliver as much as we expect or want. And as a team, collectively, we hope that we'll get other players to come up and step in and fill that gap for the time. In the meantime, do we need to surge a little effort? And will there be a point in the future where that partner, because we're still staying together and we're all in it together, is able to contribute a little bit more? I think that that's the way that we can mitigate and still through a respectful partnership, pursue in any type of an alliance agreement.
So the other part about that relationship is there are the elected officials, the politicians, and they will say things for immediacy of campaigns, and they create friction. The good thing about it is at the mill-to-mill relationship, no matter, and I would say, never say never, for the most part, whatever the political perturbation is, whether administration says, hey, we're not going to be there or whatever, the relationships at the mill-to-mill level have always been strong. They've always been solid, and there's always a foundation in what we do and what we do to serve our nations and our national interests, much of which overlaps, right? So for the NATO nations, where there may be some friction between contributions or percentages of GDP, at the end of the day, we know what we have to accomplish in uniform. Yeah. And those relationships I've always found those relationships remain very, very solid.
Good question.
Ma'am, please.
Hi, for either of you, General Buzza or General Ashley, how do you expect that Ukraine will win against Russia, and will it involve long-range missiles coming from us? And if not, how are they going to do it?
Can you introduce yourself too, please?
I'm Mary Eintum. I'm the president of World Boston, which is the counterpart organization in Boston.
Great. Well, it's going to be endurance. I mean, that's one of the things I think we could have talked about on one of the significant lessons out of that thing. It's we're looking at which side is going to be in and able to support that for the long haul, and whether or not, I don't know. I don't know that I can answer the question with the our own long-range missiles. However, these things have a tendency to change character as they develop. We clearly didn't think that this was going to be as long as it is right now. We didn't believe that they'd be in the type of trench warfare. We expected there'd be more fire and maneuver. There clearly is not nearly as much maneuver, significant amount of firepower. We also expected a greater degree of multi-domain operations. And although there are operations in multiple domains, they're not achieving convergence. So there are a lot of things. I think what I'm saying is that it's not predictable, and I don't know that I can render an opinion on whether the use of American-provided weapons in terms of long-range precision strikes is going to be a part of that conflict.
So I would say neither side is militarily capable of defeating the other in the near term. There's no way the Ukrainian military can push the Russians out of the Donbass or out of Crimea. The Russians may, in fact, envelop or put pressure which will cause a collapse in Kursk, but they're not going to Kyiv. So there's not a military solution where one side is going to defeat the other. Now, key is to watch the attrition rates, the casualties, how much the West supports the Ukrainians over time. That gap of 6 months, they're still recovering from when we didn't fund. That's very problematic. But normally, someone doesn't come with a discussion about peace or cessation of hostilities until it becomes evident to them they can no longer win. And we're not there yet. The Russians have upped the number for the recruiting by 180,000, so they're going to go, add that to their ranks. There are posters all around Kyiv and other places in Ukraine that says, "Come join. We need you." There's discussions about the exodus of Ukrainian, military-age males who can fight to come back home. So there are significant pressures. We've been very incremental in our decisions. I'm not sure what Putin's red lines are. I'm not sure if long-range, artillery into critical infrastructure and munitions facilities and things like that would cause a significant escalation. I'm not sure his decision calculus. I'm not sure anyone knows that as we move ahead. But right now, there's not a military solution to this. An interesting week coming up. President Zelensky will speak to the UN. He'll see President Biden, and he'll see former President Trump. He says, "I have a plan for peace." I do not see Putin at this point in time, engaging in any kind of meaningful peace talk. And even if they do, it would be an interim, because they'll hold the provinces in the east, they'll hold Crimea, and he'll just bide his time for the next round to launch again. So it's always interesting if you look at the history of the world, right? Our penchant for hostilities. There's always interwar periods. There's no such thing as a permanent peace. Mm-hmm. When I came on active duty in 1984, my first assignment was at Fort Bragg. I signed into the 82nd Airborne after Grenada, and I thought, okay, I missed it. I won't see hostilities in my lifetime. And then I signed out of Fort Bragg right before Just Cause, and I went, I missed it. I probably won't see hostilities in my time in uniform. And then 9/11. So I don't, it's like the Petraeus quote that was on the cover of like Newsweek or Time from Iraq. And I think it was one of the, I can't remember the historian, David Atkinson, I think, Atkinson, asked him the question, tell me how this ends. I'm not sure how this ends. In some ways it iterates forward. But it gets back to David's first point with China and Russia. How did we get this 100% wrong? So we have to understand all the dynamics. What's behind Putin's decision calculus? Where can we leverage? Where can we pressure? Do we have enough pressure? Because right now they've been able to circumvent the sanctions and everything else. The economy is still sound. I mean, they're under pressure. But there's a lot of things in play here, which is where you get into the diplomatic realm, and there's such complexity. It's, we're solving the Rubik's Cube. I know that's not probably a real satisfying answer that I can't definitively go, here it is, but that's the challenge that your diplomats and your leaders face. Now, as a member of the intelligence community, what we try to do for the diplomats, for the military leaders, is we try to reduce as much uncertainty as we can in foreign policy and give them probabilities of outcomes on certain courses of action. But it's an art and a science, and it's not definitive. Sit at a wargaming table and we go, okay, well, if we give him ATACMS and we launch this, then Putin will do what? It's more like there's a mid to high probability that he may do the following. Long answer.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll have time for one more question, then we'll move to closing arguments. So the student in the back there.
Hi, my name is Lily, and I'm a senior political science major at Quinnipiac University with a minor in public diplomacy. In 2001, my dad was an accountant and my mom was a nurse in New York City. So I was born in 2004, and even 20 years later, I still hear their stories, the people they lost, and so that's definitely something that I won't forget, and that I'm hoping that my generation, even though we were born after that, doesn't forget. And my question is a two-parter, but it also builds off of the previous discussion. In your experience, do you anticipate a change either in Russia's government or military with a generational shift of young people, especially with Generation Z speaking out against Putin, the war in Ukraine, and the death of the opposition leader Navalny? And then as the second part of this question, do you anticipate a change in the younger generation of our other adversaries?
So since I've never taken a class in diplomacy, and you have, can you answer her question? I'll take a quick swing at this one. I think we undervalue the level of nationalism that Russia has. There is a strong sense of patriotism in the Russian people. Matter of fact, Putin's ratings, whether you believe them or not, in the 70s, then you have this incursion in Kursk. I mean, they're even further behind the war. So, and then absolutely heartbreaking that Alexei Navalny passed. If you've ever watched, I can't remember, there was a special, I think it was on CNN, before he literally got on the plane and went back, and I'm watching this thing going, don't go back, don't go back. But I think part of his heart was, I'm probably going to die. I'll be a martyr. Will that motivate enough people? Because I think that Generation Z or whatever is too small. It is under the watchful eye of the Russian government, where they control a lot of information. Clearly things that we know, we see every day, gets into Russia. But I don't see Putin right now at risk. Now there's the other thing, the old adage is, How will you know there's a coup in the Kremlin? When it happens, right? Because what do? You keep people that are your sycophants, that are your supporters, close to you, whether they're capable or not. And Shoigu is a good example of somebody that wasn't really that capable. Gerasimov has struggled, but they still are close to him because you don't want someone in there that potentially can dislodge you. But I don't think there's a coup in the near term, but it could be going right now because it's one of those things where if it happens, it will happen so fast that we won't be able to react to it.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to Major General Buzza for his final comments, and then back to you, sir. Sir.
Thank you. I did want to touch on that continuous transformation because some of the topics we talked about now, it really does drive our Army to change where we're going. As we said before, we don't really know what the future is, but we do know that it's going to be complex. It's going to demand us to operate in multiple domains, and it's going to require us to operate in a range of military operations. And therefore, what we're doing in the Army in this continuous transformation piece is we're building capability in transformation in contact, is something we're fielding 3 brigades with current commercial off-the-shelf equipment to actually go test and innovate as they deploy downrange. And they're using that in the field. Commanders are seeing how it's working. We're using Mission Command on the move systems that are commercially available. And we're testing that and iterating on that to see how we should be equipping the Army for the future. The second part of that continuous transformation is in terms of like the next 5 years. That's the traditional fielding timeline for acquisitions in the Army. So then we're looking at how we do that on a regular basis, that we've, the process that already exists. But then looking forward, because I think it's a really exciting time for cadets thinking about coming into the Army now, what we're looking at then is building the Army of 2030 and beyond, the Army of 2040, where we have purpose-built formations to deal with not just large-scale combat operations, but also fight, as we were talking about with the SFABs, taking those train, advise, and assist units and actually scaling them up when necessary to do lower-level conflict. So with that, I want to say thanks to the forum for having me here. Thanks, Garrett, for inviting me. Hand it over to General Ashley.
Thank you.
All right, I'll leave you with 3 points. Be a voracious reader. Be a voracious reader. If you get a chance to take, and I'm really talking to the students, if you get a chance to take a class on negotiations, take it. It's a life skill. And the last one is because we talked about the old Cold War and the new Cold War this weekend, watch Dr. Strangelove, which is the quintessential Cold War movie from the 60s. The title is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's a parody, but there's a lot of truth in that parody. You should watch it. But thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, sir.
All right.